The heat hit like a punch. Flames climbed the south wall of the weathered wood barn, off Route 12, black smoke boiling into a hard blue sky. Ben Sutter tightened his mask and stepped forward, and a brown and white shepherd mix cut across his path, ribs sharp under matted fur. Planting herself in front of the door, she barked, not scared, insistent, like she was calling him in. Before we go on, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. The call had come in just after 2 in the afternoon. A shed fire on the outskirts of Maplewood, spreading fast toward the old barn on the property line. Engine 4 had rolled in with sirens wailing, and by the time Ben climbed down from the cab, the smoke was already punching thick and black from the south wall. 15 years on the job had taught him the shape of a bad fire, the way a farmer knows the shape of a bad storm. This one had the wrong smell. Wood and hay, sure, but something under it, sharp and wrong. Chemical, maybe. He filed the thought away and reached for his mask. Then the dog appeared. Brown patches over her ears and shoulders, white belly, tail low. She was not in his way by accident. She would run several steps toward the barn door, spin, bark, then race back to him and do it all over again, a tight, desperate loop. Nothing random about it, nothing frightened either, not exactly. She was working. Ben had seen frightened dogs before. Dogs that bolted from flames, dogs that hid in ditches, dogs that bit anyone in reach because their brains were on fire with terror. This one was different. This one had a plan. His partner, Terry Gage, jogged up beside him with the hose line braced against his hip. Terry was 31 years old and had been on the truck for 6 years, long enough to be steady, still young enough to hate losing to a fire. He tried to wave the dog off. She would not move. "She belonged to somebody?" Terry called through the roar. "Don't see a collar," Ben called back. "Don't see anybody either." He watched her another second. She trotted to the barn door, the one corner the fire had not yet fully claimed, sat down in the dirt, and barked once, loud and flat, like a command. Like something cold settled in Ben's chest. He looked at the way her belly hung, not just thin, recently nursed. He had raised a shepherd himself years ago, and he remembered the loose skin along the ribs in the weeks after a litter. This dog had puppies somewhere, and she was not leaving without them. Captain Mark Whitfield came up on Ben's left. Mark was 58 years old, silver at the temples, and had been running Engine 4 for 11 years. He had already ordered a partial withdrawal from the south wall. Roof timbers were showing dark stress lines. Time was narrowing fast. "Whatever you're thinking, think it quick," Mark said. Ben pointed at the dog. "She's a nursing mother, no collar. She keeps taking me to that door. I think her litter is inside." Mark looked at the dog. He looked at the barn. He looked at the window they had already left. Then he gave a single nod. Ben went in low. The smoke burned even through his gear, hot against his throat, and the world shrank to the 6 feet in front of his face. The dog had slipped in ahead of him through a gap in the planks. He followed the sound of her, one sharp bark, then another, drawing him deeper. Left of the main aisle, past a collapsed stall, back into a corner where the roof still held. There, under an overturned metal feed trough, pushed against the wall by someone who had wanted the litter hidden, he found them. 6 puppies, eyes barely open, curled tight against each other in the dark and the heat, ears flat, small bodies still. He counted them twice. He tucked 2 inside his coat against his chest and turned back toward the door. He cupped his hand around them because they were smaller than his palm, smaller than they had any right to be. Behind him, the mother stayed. She would not come until they all came. He carried them out 2 at a time, 3 trips, 45 seconds each, maybe less. Every time he came back through the smoke, she was still there, waiting, watching him with dark, unblinking eyes, not frantic anymore, watching, counting. When the last 2 puppies were laid in the cool grass beside the fence, 20 yards from the fire, the mother trotted out behind him and did what he already knew she was going to do. She circled the pile. She nosed each small body. She counted them by scent. Then, when the count came out right, she lay down across them and rested her chin flat on the ground. Ben Sutter, 15 years on the job, sat down in the dirt beside her and did not say a single word. 3 feet away, Terry Gage pulled off his helmet and pressed his knuckles hard against his eyes. He turned his face away so no one would see it. He was not entirely successful. Mark Whitfield stood behind them both. He let the moment breathe. Then he lifted the radio and called the all clear for the interior. The rest of the crew turned on the south wall like they meant it, and within 10 minutes, the flames were down. What was left was black and hissing and smoke-gray, but the structure held. The engine that had come in from the neighboring town of Redwater backed off. The county fire marshal, a soft-spoken man named Wallace Kellerman, arrived 20 minutes later in a dusty white truck and stood at the perimeter, jaw working. He would not come close to the shell of the barn just yet. He looked at Ben. He looked at the dog. He said nothing. Nobody came to claim the dog. Nobody came to claim the barn either, not right away. That was the first thing that struck Ben as odd. Country places burn, and neighbors come. Farmers come, owners come. This time nobody came. The mother let Ben touch her. That was the second thing. A dog that had walked strangers into a burning building did not shy from the hand of the man who had carried her babies out. She lifted her head when he crouched beside her, and she pushed her nose into his glove, and she let him rest his palm flat against her ribs. He could feel her heart. It was steady, too steady almost, like she had been through worse than this, and knew how to hold it. "You got a name, girl?" Ben asked softly. He was not expecting an answer, and he did not get one. What he got was the flat, considering look of a dog that had known a lot of people in her time and had made up her mind about only some of them. He got the vet on the radio. Dr. Nora Bell ran the small animal clinic on Cedar Street in downtown Maplewood, 7 miles east, and she was known to answer the phone even at inconvenient times. She was at the fire scene in 22 minutes flat, driving a hatchback with her clinic bag on the passenger seat and her hair tied back with a piece of gauze. She looked at the mother first. She looked at the puppies second. She looked at Ben third. "How long since they nursed, do you think?" she asked. "I don't know," Ben said. "She looks empty." Nora ran her hand along the mother's flank. "Been dehydrated a while. Not today's problem, weeks-old problem. Somebody has been keeping her thin on purpose or letting her thin on accident, and neither one is good." She checked the puppies one by one. 3 females, 3 males, 6 weeks old, maybe 7, eyes just past the pale blue newborn stage, all of them underweight, none of them injured, not one of them microchipped. "That's strange," Nora said softly when she scanned the mother. "Look at this." Ben leaned in. Nora tilted the scanner in her palm so he could see the empty screen. "No chip on Mom either," she said. "I mean, that's not by itself unusual. Plenty of country dogs never get chipped. But this dog is house-trained. Look at her posture. She's a companion. Somebody raised this dog inside a home. Somebody spent a lot of hours with her. And then somebody wasn't spending any hours with her at all, for a while." Ben glanced back at the barn. "How long is a while?" 2, maybe 3 months, Nora said. "Maybe more. Her coat is telling me a story." The story, Ben thought, was going to be worth hearing. He named her Willow because she was standing next to a young willow tree at the edge of the field, and because it was not a name that would sound like an order to anyone else. If she had a real name somewhere in her past, he would find it later. For now, Willow. They took her back to the station in the back of Engine 4's utility truck, riding in a cardboard produce box lined with clean towels, her puppies pressed against her belly. Terry rigged a whelping box out of a milk crate and an old fleece blanket in the corner of the equipment bay, and Mark went out and got a bag of puppy formula from the feed store on his own dime. And by 4 in the afternoon, Willow was lying in the crate with her 6 babies against her side, and she was letting Ben scratch the space between her ears. Ben Sutter was 42 years old. He had lived in Maplewood his whole life. His father had been a firefighter before him, and his grandfather had run a small dairy on the north side of town that had folded when Ben was in high school. He had married Rachel Sutter, née Halloran, 8 years ago at the Methodist Church on Elm Street, and they lived in a one-story house with a screened porch and a big yard that was mostly clover. There had been supposed to be a child by now. 2, they had said when they were still saying things like that. That was before the miscarriage 16 months ago at 18 weeks, and the long quiet that had come after. Rachel had gone back to her job at the county library. Ben had gone back to Engine 4. They had not stopped loving each other. They had only stopped talking about certain rooms in their house that were still painted the color they had been painted before. He called Rachel from the parking lot at 5 o'clock, standing next to the utility truck with his helmet under his arm. "There's a dog," he said. "There's actually 7 dogs." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Rachel said, in a voice he had not heard in a long time, "Bring them home." He got home at 7 that evening, and Rachel had cleared the corner of the mudroom. She had put down old towels and a heat lamp from the garage. She had a bowl of warm water and a smaller bowl of goat milk that she had picked up from the co-op on her lunch break. She had not asked how many puppies again. She had just prepared as if the answer were always going to be more than she thought. When Ben carried Willow through the door in his arms, the puppies came behind him in the milk crate that Terry had lent him. Rachel took one look at the mother and put her hand over her mouth. Willow lay perfectly still in Ben's arms and looked at Rachel with the same considering look she had given Ben in the field. Then she reached out and touched her nose very lightly to Rachel's wrist. Rachel exhaled a sound that was half laugh and half something else, and she took Willow from Ben and carried her the last few feet to the mudroom herself. That was the first night. Rachel sat on the floor beside the crate for 2 hours after supper, saying nothing at all, watching the puppies find the milk bowl by scent and knock it over and find it again. Ben stood in the doorway with a mug of coffee that he did not drink. He watched Rachel's face soften into something that had been away from her for over a year. He did not want to breathe wrong and make it leave. The second morning, Ben went back to the station and Rachel stayed home with the litter, and by noon she had already sent him 27 photographs of small brown and white puppies sleeping in a heap. She would not tell him she had already named them all. She would not tell him that yet. She would only send the pictures. Chief Wallace Kellerman came to the station at 10:30 that morning. Wallace was 71 years old, still going, still the county fire marshal, because nobody else wanted the job, and he was better at it than anyone else in 3 counties. He carried a small leather notebook and a pen with a chewed cap, and he sat down across from Ben in the day room without asking whether it was a good time. "The barn was arson," Wallace said. He did not sound surprised. "Accelerant on the west side, low along the wall, traces on the floor of what used to be the tack room, not sophisticated. Somebody splashed it and lit it and left in a hurry." Ben was not surprised either. He had smelled it going in. "Who owns the barn?" Ben asked. Wallace opened the notebook. He turned a page. He read, "Property of record is a limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware," Wallace said. "That company is owned by another company registered in Nevada. That company is owned by a trust. The trust is administered by a law office in Boston, Massachusetts. The whole arrangement," Wallace said, closing the notebook, "was set up to make sure that no one whose name is in the phone book ever has to answer a question about that barn." Ben leaned back in his chair. "So somebody was hiding something. Somebody spent $7,000 or $8,000 in legal fees hiding something," Wallace said. "Which means what they were hiding was worth more than that." Ben told him about the dog. He told him about the crate placement, the metal trough over the puppies, in the corner farthest from the door, where nobody who ran into the barn to save an animal would think to look. He told him about the way Willow's ribs showed and the way her coat had gone dull along the shoulders. He told him what Nora Bell had said. Wallace wrote it all down in a slow, careful hand. "There is a barn," Wallace said when Ben was done, "that has not held hay in a long time. There is a mother dog that has been kept thin. There are 6 unchipped puppies in a corner where no one was meant to find them. And there is a fire that was set by hand." He looked up from the notebook. "You know what I think, Ben." "I think it too," Ben said. They drove out to the burned husk of the barn the next afternoon and found what Wallace had been expecting to find. On the north side of the structure, in a stretch of wall that had not caught, were the outlines of chicken wire kennels that had been taken down in a hurry. The dirt underneath was compacted in 6 long rectangles where cages had sat for months. There was a torn plastic bag of dry kibble marked with a brand nobody in Maplewood carried. There was a stack of empty 5-gallon water jugs behind a lean-to at the far side of the yard, still smelling faintly of chlorine bleach. A single blue collar with a broken buckle was caught on a nail beside the loading gate. It was too small for Willow. "They were breeding here," Ben said quietly. "They were breeding here and moving them," Wallace said. "Somebody set the fire when they realized they were about to be looked at. Question is, who realized what and when?" He walked slowly around the perimeter of the burn. He crouched down at a spot near the old feed shed and picked up a piece of paper that had been under a scorched board. It was a shipping label. It was addressed to a private residence in a town 2 states over. The sender's line had been left blank. "They were shipping the older ones out," Wallace said. "Fast. And they were shipping them under a name that never went on the paper." He tucked the label into the notebook. "That is the kind of business that keeps going until somebody makes it stop." Ben looked at the corner of the burn where he had crawled 2 days before with 6 small bodies in the pocket of his coat. "Then we make it stop," he said. Wallace nodded and did not say anything for a while. At the station, Willow had begun to eat. On the first morning, she had left the bowl alone for hours, watching it from across the crate like a person who has been offered a good meal too many times as a trap. By the second morning, she was drinking water in slow, careful laps, one paw braced on the edge of the bowl, not looking away from Ben's boots. By the third morning, she had cleaned the bowl and pushed the empty dish across the concrete floor with her nose, and she had looked at Terry Gage in a way that Terry had reported back to the crew as, quote, "the most polite and demanding thing he had ever seen a dog do without saying a word." She would let Rachel handle the puppies. She would let Ben handle the puppies. She would not let anyone else near them at all. When the deputy sheriff had come by to take a statement on the barn, Willow had stood up in the crate and put herself between the man and her babies, and the deputy, who was a large young man from a family of hound dog raisers and had a healthy respect for what a dog was telling him, had backed all the way across the equipment bay to conduct his interview. Terry made a joke about it. "She's a better door than the door." Ben watched her that evening after Terry had gone home. He crouched down in front of the crate and let her sniff the back of his hand and put her chin on his knee. And he thought about how strange it was that a dog like this, clearly a companion animal, clearly raised somewhere in a room with rugs, had ended up in a corner of a burning building with her babies, hidden under a piece of metal. Somebody had loved her. Somebody had stopped. She was carrying the shape of both those things at once. He did not know it yet, but the first person who was going to come looking for her was not the person who had loved her. Diane Kessler walked into the fire station at 3 in the afternoon on a Thursday, 7 days after the fire. She was 48 years old, dressed in a beige jacket and pale jeans, and she had a manila envelope under her arm. She did not smile when she introduced herself. She said she had come for her dog. Ben was in the day room with Terry when the desk called back. He walked out to the front counter and looked at her. She looked at him. There was no warmth in her eyes at all. There was only the calm of a person who had decided that a thing was going to happen. "I understand you have a shepherd mix that was recovered from a fire on Route 12, Diane said. "That dog is mine. Her name is Bella. I have papers." She slid the envelope across the counter. Inside were what appeared to be vaccination records dated the year before. A photograph of a dog that looked broadly like Willow, but was thinner across the shoulders and had a slightly different pattern of white on the chest, and a printed pedigree from a website Ben did not recognize. "May I see her?" Diane asked. Ben studied her. Something under his skin was refusing to move. "You can wait," he said. "Let me get Captain Whitfield." He went to the back and got Mark. Mark looked at the envelope, then at Diane. He asked her to come with him to the equipment bay. She followed. Ben came behind them. Willow was in the whelping crate, lying on her side, the puppies in a row along her belly. When the three of them stepped through the door, Willow lifted her head. She looked at Mark. She looked at Ben. She looked at Diane. She stood up, slowly. She placed her body directly between the puppies and the woman, and she lowered her head, and she pulled her lips back over her teeth without a sound. She had not growled in 7 days. Diane took one step forward, and Willow's growl rolled out of her chest low and long, and it did not stop until Diane took 2 steps back. "She has been traumatized by the fire," Diane said, in a voice that had not lost its calm at all. "She does not recognize me because of the trauma. This is a well-documented reaction. I will need to reintroduce myself to her gradually. In the meantime, I will need to take my puppies home. Any veterinarian will agree that they are best raised in a stable home environment." Ben and Mark looked at each other. Neither of them moved. "We are not going to release the dog or the puppies today," Mark said. His voice was very polite. "We have an open investigation and pending veterinary confirmation of ownership. We appreciate your paperwork, and we will pass it to the appropriate authority." "That is not acceptable," Diane said. "That is what is going to happen," Mark said. She left. She did not thank them. She got into a dark grey sedan with plates from 3 counties over and drove away, and Ben stood at the window and watched her go, and he thought, she was not surprised. She had known what he was going to say and had come anyway. That was because she was here to establish a claim, not to take the dog, not today, to make sure that somewhere on paper someone had said the words, "I am the owner." Ben called Wallace Kellerman that evening. He told him about the visit. He read him the name off the papers. He read him the plate number he had memorized. Wallace was quiet for a long time. "Diane Kessler," Wallace said at last. "There is a Diane Kessler in Redwater who runs a boarding kennel that has been inspected 3 times in 5 years and cited twice. There is also a Diane Kessler listed on the board of a shell company that leases pasture in 3 counties. I would bet you money it is the same one." "So she is part of it," Ben said. "She is part of something," Wallace said. "Whether it is all of it, we do not know yet." That night, Ben lay in bed next to Rachel with his hands folded on his chest and his eyes open in the dark. Junie, because that is what Rachel had begun to call the smallest female without meaning to, and now the name had stuck to the puppy the way a shirt sticks to a nail, was making small, sleepy sounds down the hall. He listened to her, and he thought about the woman who had walked into the station that afternoon, and he thought about the way Willow's growl had come up from a place inside her that she had not shown Ben in 7 days. Willow had known Diane Kessler, and Willow had not wanted her babies to know her. The next Monday afternoon, a young woman came to the station. She was 26 years old, and her name was Sarah Warren. She had reddish-brown hair pulled back in a low ponytail, and she wore a dark green sweater, and she had been crying not too long before she came in. She was holding a manila folder of her own. She did not slide it across the counter. She asked very quietly if she could speak to whoever had rescued the dogs from the fire. She said she thought one of them might have belonged to her grandmother. Ben came out of the back. Sarah opened the folder. She took out a photograph. She laid it on the counter very gently with both hands. The photograph was of an older woman, 70 or so, sitting on a porch swing with a brown and white shepherd mix in her lap. The dog's ears were up. Her mouth was open in what looked like a smile. There was a small white blaze on the top of her nose in a shape like a leaf. Ben looked at the photograph. He looked at Sarah. He said, "Come with me." He walked her back to the equipment bay. Willow was up in the crate, sitting alert, watching the door. When Sarah stepped through, Willow's ears came forward. Her mouth opened slightly, her tail lifted. Sarah did not say anything. She only sank down onto her knees at the door of the crate and held out her hand very slowly, palm up. Willow came out of the crate, walked to her, and pressed her whole forehead into the palm of Sarah's hand. Sarah began to cry without any noise at all. "Her name is Duchess," Sarah said after a minute. "She belonged to my grandmother Elsie. My grandmother died in March. Duchess disappeared 4 days after the funeral. I have been calling shelters every week for 4 months. Ben brought Sarah to the day room and got her a cup of water. She held the cup with both hands and did not drink from it. She told him what she knew. Her grandmother, Elsie Warren, had lived on a small property just outside Maplewood for 40 years. Elsie's husband had died in the year 2008, and after that, she had lived alone with her dog. Duchess had come to her as a puppy 8 years ago from a rescue on the coast, a gift from Sarah's mother, who had died 2 years before that, and who had been Elsie's only child. Duchess had been the last living thing in the world that had known both Sarah's mother and Sarah's grandmother. Elsie had adored her. She had walked Duchess every morning at 7 o'clock on the same 3/4 of a mile of dirt road that led past the neighbor's mailbox and back. She had cooked chicken for her on Sundays. She had let her sleep at the foot of the bed even after she got old and grey around the muzzle. She had, in the last 2 years of her life, when her hips had begun to give her trouble, learned to bend down slowly with one hand on the counter so that she could still be the one who set Duchess's bowl on the floor. Elsie had died in March, at the age of 72, of a heart attack in her kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Sarah had gotten the call at work. She had gone to the property that afternoon. Duchess had been there. Sarah had held the dog for a long time and had promised her out loud that she would come back for her. The problem was that the property had gone into the hands of a distant cousin who had inherited under a will that Sarah had never seen. Sarah had asked about Duchess. The cousin had said the dog was being handled by the estate. 4 days after Elsie was buried, Sarah drove out to the property to bring Duchess home with her. Duchess was not there. The cousin was not there. The house was locked. When Sarah finally reached the cousin by phone, he said Duchess had run off. He said it had happened before. He said she would come back. She did not come back. Sarah called every shelter in the county. She posted photographs on every lost pet page, on every social network she could find. She called Elsie's veterinarian to ask if anyone had brought Duchess in with an injury. The veterinarian, a Dr. Preston Owens, who had cared for Duchess since she was a puppy, had told her that Duchess had a microchip. The chip had been implanted in the year 2018, when the manufacturer had switched to a new frequency. It was a low-frequency chip. Most modern scanners did not read it unless they were set to the second frequency and the operator knew to check. Dr. Nora Bell had not checked. She had not thought to check because the modern chips were the ones that turned up 9 times out of 10, and because she had been standing in a field beside a burning barn with a dehydrated dog and 6 half-starved puppies, and had done the scan that 99 dogs out of 100 needed. Ben stopped Sarah in the middle of her sentence and picked up the phone and called Nora Bell. Nora Bell drove over from the clinic with her scanner and a second frequency reader, and she read the chip in Willow's shoulder in 9 seconds flat. The chip was registered to Elsie Warren of Maplewood. Ben looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Duchess, who had not left Sarah's side since she had walked in. Sarah put her forehead against Duchess's forehead and did not lift it for a long time. Wallace Kellerman came in that evening. He read Sarah's paperwork. He read Nora's chip printout. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands together on the table. "The cousin," Wallace said. "What is his name?" Sarah opened the folder again and pulled out a page. "His name is Curtis Ashcroft. He is the son of my grandmother's late sister-in-law. He lives in Boston." Ben and Wallace looked at each other. "Boston," Wallace said, "as in the law office in Boston." "As in the law office in Boston," Ben said. Curtis Ashcroft was 39 years old, an attorney at a mid-sized firm in the financial district in Boston, and he was the son of Deborah Ashcroft, who was the sister of Elsie Warren's late husband. Deborah had died in the year 2017. Curtis had grown up spending summers on the Warren property when he was a child. He had not visited in 12 years. Sarah had met him twice. She had not liked him either time. He was also, according to Wallace's investigation over the following 6 days, listed as a beneficiary on the trust that owned the barn on Route 12. The picture that came together over the next 2 weeks was ugly and clear. Wallace laid it out on the kitchen table at Ben and Rachel's house one evening, over a plate of Rachel's meatloaf and a pitcher of iced tea, with Sarah sitting across from him and Duchess lying at Sarah's feet. Curtis Ashcroft had inherited a chunk of Elsie's estate through a will amendment that had been signed 2 months before her death. Sarah had never been shown the amendment. Elsie's longtime attorney in Maplewood, an elderly man named Franklin Bird, who had known Elsie since before Sarah was born, had also never seen the amendment. It had been drafted by the Boston firm. It gave Curtis the property, the vehicles, and in a separate provision written in careful legal language, any and all domestic animals belonging to the decedent. Elsie had signed that document, or someone with a hand very like hers had signed it. Sarah stared at the copy Wallace produced, and she said in a very quiet voice, "This is not my grandmother's signature. Not exactly. The line at the top of the E is wrong." "That is something we will look into," Wallace said gently. Curtis Ashcroft had not run a puppy mill himself. He was too far away and too clean-handed for that, but he had leased the barn property and its adjoining pasture to a woman named Diane Kessler, who had. Diane had been running a small breeding operation out of the property behind the barn on Route 12 for 2.5 years, buying, breeding and shipping shepherd mixes to buyers in 3 states. She had also, in the month since Elsie's death, expanded her operation to include the Warren property itself. Duchess had gone into her operation 4 days after Elsie's funeral. Diane had bred her twice in that time. Duchess had held on to her second litter through winter and spring, and one afternoon in July, when Diane had gotten word from somewhere that the county was going to look at the barn, she had decided to burn the evidence. She had gotten most of the older breeding stock out that morning. She had loaded them into a stock trailer and driven them north to a second property her cousin ran outside Vernon Falls. Duchess and her puppies had been left behind on purpose. They had been in the corner farthest from the door, hidden under a metal feed trough. And Diane had walked out of the barn and lit the accelerant, knowing that 6 puppies and their mother were inside. That was the piece that Ben Sutter, 15 years on the job, had the most trouble sitting still with. He got up from the table and walked out onto the screened porch and stood there for a long time with his hands braced on the rail. Rachel came out after a while and put her hand between his shoulder blades and said nothing at all. From inside the house came the small, sleepy, scuffling sound of 6 puppies rearranging themselves in a pile. The world had asked Duchess to do the only thing left, and Duchess had done it. She had walked out to the fence line, and she had barked at the first man who came near the fire until he understood what she was telling him. Diane Kessler was not a fool, and she had not lit the fire without preparing for what would come after. She had filed her ownership paperwork on Willow 2 days before she had walked into the fire station. She had done it at a county courthouse 2 lines north, where nobody knew her name. Her paperwork identified Willow as Bella, and it had been signed by a veterinarian in that same northern county who, it turned out later, did not exist. The license number belonged to a woman who had retired to Florida 4 years earlier, but the paperwork was on record, and the record moved slowly. Curtis Ashcroft flew into the county airport on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the fire. He was tall and thin and wore a suit that was too warm for the season. He came with a lawyer from a smaller firm downtown, a man named Elliot Hawes, who did not look happy to be there. Curtis went straight to the sheriff's office. He said he was there to collect the property of the estate of Elsie Warren, including any animals. Sheriff Ellis Rourke was 61 years old and had known Elsie Warren for 30 years. He listened to Curtis Ashcroft for approximately 4 minutes. Then he told him that if he wanted the animals, he would have to petition the county probate court. He also told him that the animals were currently in the custody of a firefighter who was fostering them under the direction of the county fire marshal, pending completion of an arson investigation in which the trust that owned the barn was a person of interest. Curtis Ashcroft's face went through several colors and settled on a very pale one. He and Elliot Hawes left the office and drove to the courthouse. The probate hearing was set for a Friday, 13 days later. In the meantime, Willow and her puppies stayed at Ben and Rachel Sutter's house on Cedar Lane, and Sarah Warren came over every evening after work, and Rachel Sutter set an extra plate at the table without being asked. Duchess would climb up onto the couch after supper and put her chin on Sarah's knee, and Sarah would rest her hand on the top of Duchess's head, and the two of them would sit like that in silence while Rachel washed the dishes and Ben dried them, and the puppies climbed on everybody's shoes. On the Wednesday before the hearing, Sarah came over with a small cardboard box. Inside the box was a book. She had found it in a bin at the property that Curtis had not yet emptied. The one her grandmother's estate was still being fought over, and it was Elsie's journal from the last 3 years of her life. Elsie had written in it almost every day. Sarah read one page out loud at the kitchen table. It was dated the 2nd week of January in the year Elsie had died. It said, "Curtis came again today. He wanted me to sign a paper. I told him I would look at it with Franklin next month. He was very unhappy. He tried to tell me it was only about taxes. I have been on this earth long enough to know what a paper about taxes looks like. This one was not that. Duchess did not like him. She sat under my chair the whole time he was here." Sarah closed the book and set it on the table. Nobody said anything for a while. Ben looked at Duchess, who was lying at Sarah's feet with her eyes half open. Duchess opened her eyes a little wider and looked back at him. Then she put her head down. The hearing began at 9 in the morning. Judge Miriam Kennedy presided. Curtis Ashcroft sat at one table with Elliot Hawes. Sarah Warren sat at the other with Franklin Byrd, Elsie's old attorney, who had come out of semi-retirement to represent her. Diane Kessler sat in the back row with a lawyer of her own, a woman named Rita Volk, who had a reputation for winning small cases by making them boring. Rita Volk went first. She stood up and presented Diane's ownership paperwork on Willow. She presented the vaccination records and the pedigree and a signed statement from a person named Dr. Adrian Pearl, licensed veterinarian in the state, who had personally examined Bella and confirmed her identity. Diane, Rita said, was heartbroken to have lost her dog in the fire and elated to have found her again. Franklin Byrd stood up next. He was 78 years old. He moved slowly. He introduced the photograph of Elsie Warren and Duchess. He introduced the microchip printout dated 2018. He introduced the records of Dr. Preston Owens going back 8 years. He introduced Elsie's journal, and he read the January entry into the record. Then he asked quietly whether the court would like to see the dog itself. The court would. Willow was walked in on a lead by Ben Sutter, and she walked to the middle of the room, and she sat down, and she looked around like a dog that had been in many rooms in her time and did not intend to be rushed. Franklin Byrd asked Sarah Warren to call the dog by name. "Duchess," Sarah said from her chair. The dog's head came up. Her tail moved. She stood up and walked directly to Sarah and put her chin on Sarah's knee. Rita Volk asked to be allowed to try. She was permitted. She came around the table. "Bella," she called. The dog did not turn her head. Rita called the name 3 times. Nothing. Judge Kennedy looked over her glasses. "I have observed the dog," she said, "and I will accept the microchip and the veterinary records as controlling evidence of ownership at the time of Ms. Elsie Warren's death. The dog is a portion of the estate." That was when Diane Kessler stood up in the back of the room. "The dog is a portion of the estate," she said, in a voice that carried. "That is fine. I do not contest that. I contest the puppies. The puppies were born on my property from breeding stock I paid for, and they are mine under the standard breeder's contract." Franklin Byrd turned to look at her. So did the judge. So did Ben. Rita Volk stood up slowly and produced a second folder. This one contained a lease agreement between Diane Kessler and a limited liability company called Warren Holdings, granting Diane the right to breed animals resident on the leased property. The document was dated the 5th of April, 1 month after Elsie's death. It was signed by Curtis Ashcroft as trustee. Judge Kennedy studied the document for a full minute. She read it a second time. She looked up at Curtis Ashcroft. Curtis Ashcroft looked at his hands. "This document," she said, "is dated after Ms. Warren's passing. It grants breeding rights over an animal that was, at the time of the signing, no longer legally the property of the trust, because the animal was, at that time, the property of a residuary heir, which the record now shows was not Mr. Ashcroft. Mr. Ashcroft was not empowered to grant those rights. This document is void." She looked at Rita Volk. "You may petition for the puppies at a subsequent hearing, if you wish. In the meantime, the puppies remain with the Foster family." Rita Volk sat down. Diane Kessler did not. Curtis Ashcroft looked at the ceiling. The judge banged her gavel. Outside the courthouse, on the wide stone steps, Sarah stood in the sun and cried into Rachel's shoulder. Ben stood a few feet away with Franklin Byrd, and Franklin, who did not smile often, was smiling. Duchess sat between them on the leash and watched the traffic on Court Street with mild, polite interest, as if she had been through many courthouses in her time and had, again, made up her mind about only some of them. Diane Kessler came down the steps behind them and passed within 3 feet of Sarah without stopping. She was on her phone. She did not look at any of them. She got into her car and drove away. Ben watched her go and did not like the shape of the way she was walking. It was too calm. It was too easy. It was the walk of a person who was not finished. He was right about that. Diane Kessler was arrested the following Tuesday. Wallace's file on her operation had grown to 200 pages, and it was thick enough that a young prosecutor named Rachel Ochoa took it into the district attorney's office on Monday and had the warrant signed by lunchtime. Diane was arrested at her boarding kennel on the outskirts of Redwater on charges of arson in the 1st degree, cruelty to animals, and fraud in the amended amounts on her tax filings for the past 3 fiscal years. She was released on bail 4 hours later. That was the shape of a small-town crime prosecution in a case that involved shell corporations and no dead humans. The wheels turned, but slowly. On the Wednesday morning, Ben Sutter got up at 6:30 to make coffee and let Willow out into the backyard, and Willow was not in her bed. Neither were the puppies. He stood in the kitchen a moment longer than he should have. He set the coffee cup down carefully on the counter, as if it was somehow important not to spill it. Then he walked through the mudroom and out onto the back porch. The back gate was open. The latch had been lifted cleanly by a hand that knew where to find it. There were no marks on the wood. There was a single tire print at the mouth of the alley behind the property. It was a wide tire from a light truck, and the tread pattern matched a print Wallace Kellerman had photographed in the dirt behind the barn on Route 12. Ben called Wallace, and then he called Mark, and then he called Terry, and by 7 in the morning there were 4 grown men in his kitchen, and Rachel was standing in the doorway with both hands pressed against her mouth, and Sarah Warren was on her way over in her car with tears already on her face. Ben Sutter did not say anything for a long time. He stood at the sink and stared at the dish towel that Rachel had left folded on the counter. Junie's water bowl was still by the door. The little indent in the fleece blanket where Willow had been lying was still there, still holding the shape of her. He put his hand on Rachel's cheek. He said, "I am going to get her back." Rachel nodded and did not answer because she could not. She held onto his forearm for a moment, and then she let him go. He took his coat and got into the truck. He did not have a plan. He had a direction. The stock trailer that had left the barn on the morning of the fire had gone north. That was what Wallace had said. There were 3 back roads out of the county that a person could take with a stock trailer without going through a weigh station. Ben knew all 3 because his father had known all 3 and had shown them to him when he was a boy. Terry got into the truck with him. Mark stayed at the house with Rachel and Sarah in case the phone rang. They drove north. At a gas station in the town of Vernon Falls, 40 miles up, they showed a photograph of Diane Kessler to the clerk. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with hair the color of wheat, took the photograph in her hand and studied it for maybe 10 seconds. Then she nodded. "She came through around midnight," the clerk said. "She bought 2 bags of ice and a case of bottled water and a family-sized bag of dry dog food. She was driving a light truck with a covered trailer. She turned east onto County Road 11 when she left." Ben thanked her. He and Terry got back into the truck and turned east onto County Road 11. At a diner 12 miles down, a waitress named Josie remembered Diane too, and remembered that Diane had asked about a farm belonging to a man named Nolan Ashcroft, and that Josie had told her the farm was another 8 miles out, on the right, past a stand of pine, past a shuttered feed store, past a mailbox with the numbers half fallen off. Nolan Ashcroft was Curtis's cousin, and he lived on a property that had been in the extended family since before the county had been platted. It was, according to public records, a working horse farm. According to Wallace Kellerman's file, it had not held a working horse in 6 years. Ben and Terry pulled off the road half a mile from the property and left the truck in a stand of trees, and they walked in through the fields on foot. It was 10:15 in the morning. The sky was grey and the air was still. Grasshoppers rose in front of Ben's boots and settled behind them. They came in past the tree line at the back of the property. The barn was straight ahead, a long, low structure with a tin roof and a wide sliding door on the south side. The stock trailer was parked behind it, backed up close, the gate lowered against the barn wall like a ramp. Ben walked to the trailer first. It was locked. It had been locked for hours. The metal was cool to his palm. He put his ear against the side of it, and he heard nothing. His heart went cold. He looked at Terry. Terry looked at him. Ben walked around to the front of the barn. The main door was cracked. He listened. Inside, he heard a woman's voice, sharp and irritated, telling somebody named Marlon to hurry up. He heard the scrape of a metal cage being dragged across a concrete floor. He heard, very faintly, the small mewling sound of a young puppy that had been separated from its mother. Ben Sutter did not think about it. He stepped back to the stock trailer, and with a piece of rebar he found leaning against the barn wall, broke the padlock in a single practiced strike. The lock hit the concrete with a bright metal ring, and the trailer gate dropped an inch, and Ben pulled it open. Willow came out of the trailer like a shot. She did not stop to look at him. She was gone across the yard and around the side of the barn before Ben and Terry could catch their breath. And she was already inside the main door when they got there, and she was already standing over her 6 puppies in a corner of the concrete floor, with her teeth bare and her body low, and Diane Kessler was 2 feet away with a plastic crate in her hand and a look on her face like a person who was watching everything she had built collapse under her. Beside Diane stood a heavy-set man in his 30s named Marlon Ashcroft, who was another cousin and who was holding another crate, and who dropped it the moment he saw Ben Sutter in his firefighter's coat step through the doorway with a piece of rebar in his hand. Diane took a step back from the puppies. She lifted the plastic crate as if to set it down carefully. Her eyes moved from Ben to Terry to the door behind them. "Do not," Ben said quietly. She set the crate down, very slowly. The county deputies came within 10 minutes. Wallace Kellerman had made the call from Ben's kitchen the second Ben had left the house. Sheriff Ellis Rourke had radioed ahead to the state police station at Vernon Falls. When Diane Kessler stepped back from the puppies with her plastic crate still in her hand, there were 4 cruisers at the gate and 1 at the back road and 1 blocking the trailer. Marlon Ashcroft, who did not seem to entirely understand what was happening, was cuffed on the ground before he finished the sentence he had begun. Diane Kessler was arrested for the second time in 2 weeks. This time, she was not released on bail. The charges were arson in the 1st degree, felony theft, animal cruelty in the 2nd degree, and, once the paperwork on the fake veterinary records had been unwound, a state-level felony for fraud on a court. The state's attorney filed a motion to hold her without bail on the grounds that she was a flight risk. Judge Kennedy granted the motion inside of an hour. Ben stayed at the barn until the deputies had bagged everything they needed. He and Terry loaded Willow and her 6 puppies into the back of the utility truck they had brought, one at a time, into a milk crate that Ben had laid a fresh fleece blanket in on the way up. Willow climbed into the crate on her own. She sat down in the center of it with her puppies pressed against her belly. She let out one long, slow breath. She put her chin down on the fleece and closed her eyes. Ben drove back to Maplewood at 45 miles an hour, all the way, both hands on the wheel. Terry watched the road with him. Neither of them said a word until they crossed the county line. Then Terry said, "I want one." Ben laughed. It was the first time he had laughed in a week. "Take your pick," he said. Curtis Ashcroft was disbarred within 4 months. The investigation into the amended will took longer, but by the following spring, the state attorney's office had opened a formal fraud case, and by summer, Curtis had signed a plea agreement that returned every dollar of the estate to Sarah Warren and cost him his license and a year of supervised release. The trust that owned the barn was unwound. The Boston law firm that had drafted the paperwork issued a statement that used the phrase "isolated failure of internal oversight" 3 separate times. 2 of its partners took an early retirement. The barn property on Route 12 was sold at auction. Sarah Warren, using part of what her grandmother had actually intended her to inherit, bought it back. Willow came home with Sarah, and Sarah started calling her Duchess again in front of everybody, and Duchess started answering to it in front of everybody, and by the end of the 1st month, it was as if the name Willow had never been. The puppies came home with Ben and Rachel Sutter and Terry Gage and Mark Whitfield and Wallace Kellerman and Nora Bell and one of the deputies who had been at the gate that morning at Nolan Ashcroft's barn, a man named Doug Perotta, who had a daughter turning 8 years old in September and who had never, he said no to his daughter about anything and did not intend to start now. Ben and Rachel kept the smallest female. Rachel had named her Junie in her head on the first evening in the mudroom. It turned out that Rachel had named all of them in the first evening and had simply been waiting to see which one stayed. Junie stayed. The nursery upstairs, the room that had been painted a color and then closed for over a year, got opened again 3 months later and repainted a different color, this time a soft green for a puppy. And later, when Rachel finally worked up the courage to say the words out loud to Ben in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, she painted a smaller square of it a 3rd color in the corner for a person who had not arrived yet, but who they had decided to try for again. They kept trying. That was as much as they said out loud at first, but Ben caught her looking at the corner one evening with a hand pressed lightly to her belly, and she caught him looking at her, and neither one of them said anything more that night. They only sat on the couch and let Junie climb from Rachel's lap to Ben's and back again, and let the last of the light drain out of the windows onto the wood floor. 1 year later, on a warm Saturday in early July, the community held a barn raising on the property just off Route 12. The old burned barn had been cleared away, and Sarah Warren had commissioned a new one. It was smaller than the original, and it was going to house horses instead of secrets. The volunteers came from all over the county. The Methodist Church brought food. The high school shop class helped with framing. Wallace Kellerman brought a case of soda pop from the market and sat under a tree and told anyone who would listen that this was the first thing that had happened on that ground in 10 years that anyone should be proud of. Ben Sutter came with Rachel. Junie came with them, on a leash that she did not really need, because she had never in her 1 year of life been more than 6 feet from Rachel by choice. Sarah brought Duchess. Terry brought his own puppy, whom he had named Boone, and who was now a lanky young dog with feet that were still too big for him. Mark brought his, whom he had named Bandit, because Bandit had eaten 2 of his good boots in 1 month. Nora brought hers, whom she had named Marigold, and Wallace brought his, whom he had named Chief, in a tone of voice that made Chief think he was actually in charge. Doug Perotta's daughter, now 9 years old, came with her puppy, whom she had named Star. The last of the 6, a small, quiet male, had gone home with Franklin Bird, the old attorney, and Franklin had come to the barn raising with him tucked under one arm and had spent the morning introducing him to everyone as judge, which nobody had the heart to tell Franklin was a strange thing to name a dog. At noon, when the frame was up and lunch was being laid out on trestle tables in the field, Ben walked around to the back corner of the new barn, to the corner that in the old building had been the farthest one from the door, the corner where he had crawled on his belly through smoke a year before and found 6 small bodies pressed against each other in the dark. He put his hand flat on the new wood. He stood there a long time. Duchess came up beside him and sat down on his boot. She did not bark, she did not paw at him, she just leaned her shoulder against his shin, the way she had leaned against him in the grass on the day of the fire, when she had counted her puppies by nose and lain down across them and rested her chin on the ground. Rachel came up behind him and put her hand on his back. She did not say anything either. Junie sat down at Rachel's feet and looked up at both of them and yawned a wide pink puppy yawn. Sarah walked out from the tables and joined them. She stood on the other side of Duchess and rested her hand on the top of Duchess's head. She looked at the wood of the new barn. "Grandma would have liked this," Sarah said. "She would have," Rachel said. Ben Sutter, 15 years on the job, sat down in the dirt beside the dog and closed his eyes and let the sun come down warm on his face. He thought about how a dog with no collar had walked him into a burning building. He thought about how she had asked for nothing except that he look where she was pointing. He thought about how sometimes the world puts a small hand on your sleeve and shows you a corner of itself that you are not required to notice, and how the only thing it asks is that you notice it anyway. He thought about Rachel, standing in the mudroom that first evening with a bowl of goat milk and a heat lamp and a look on her face that he had not seen in over a year. He thought about the corner of the nursery, painted a color they had never used, waiting. Junie waddled over from the tables with a corner of somebody's sandwich in her mouth, and Rachel laughed for the first time all summer in a way that came from the bottom of her chest. And Duchess lifted her head and watched the small dog come, and everything that had begun in fire ended in an ordinary afternoon of ordinary people eating ordinary food together in a field that had once been the worst place any of them had ever seen. If this story moved you, take a second right now to give it a like. Drop a comment about the moment that stayed with you the most, and share it with someone who could use a reminder that kindness still has a place in this world. And if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe. The world can be a hard place. Stories like this, where the corner farthest from the door turns out to be the corner someone finds you in, those are worth keeping close.